Good morning, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Perfect. My name is Rod Fournier. I'm the general manager at the DTA. And on behalf of everybody at the DTA, we welcome you to our beautiful city. Many of you have been here before, but as you can see, we got a lot going on in the city. So how great is this? Get everybody together. That's fantastic. Feels like years since we've been able to do this. Well, actually it has been. I think we're all tired of the virtual world we're living in, and we're slowly moving out of that, but we all get tired of, Rod, you're on mute, or turn your camera off. And although there is something to be said about meeting with shirt, tie, and gym shorts, so there's that. And I know we got our virtual friends out there, so we wish they were here. A lot of great things are happening at the DTA as well. We're entering the late stages of our comprehensive operational analysis, which we've dubbed the Better Bus Blueprint. It is something that we're extremely excited about. It is literally, for the first time in our history, it's a reimagining and redesigning of our whole transit system. And the staff's been working extremely hard at that. And I would encourage everybody to attend our session tomorrow afternoon. Get a really good look at what a COA looks like in today's world. I think to a person, we kind of thought we might be all farther down the pandemic path than we are. But it's also a unique opportunity. It's a chance to get together as an industry, share experiences, ideas, and kind of work to rebuild to where we were a couple of years ago, because we're all in the same boat together. It's a great opportunity to connect with your transit neighbors and kind of discuss the strategies they're employing to kind of what we're going to look like post-pandemic. I also encourage you to move about the city. Beautiful city. Our beautiful lake walk that the city's worked so hard to restore and try to make anti-Lake Superior proof, which is a full-time job. And use our transit system. Your badge is your pass. There's free rides for all conference attendees while you're in the city here. So once again, welcome. And I would like to take this opportunity to introduce Mayor Emily Larson. Mayor Larson was elected overwhelmingly in the fall of 2015, and she was reelected in November of 2019. And prior to that, she was the city council president. So with that, I'll introduce Mayor Larson.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. That was actually pretty good. I was expecting it to be a little grayer, like the day, like foggy. But of course, you are here and energized and ready to go. My name is Emily. I work here as mayor. Thank you for that nice introduction. Thank you for everything the DTA does. I am a big fan of the DTA and actually use that as my primary mode of transportation until I was 28 years old and pregnant. My husband and I decided that we should get a car. So big fan of the DTA for a long time. Want to tell you just briefly a few things that we're up to here in the city of Duluth. One of the things that I have learned in this role and in leadership is how important it is, some of these fundamental foundational elements upon which people can build their lives. And transportation is certainly one of them. In fact, already today, I have had a phone call and 2 emails on the transportation issue, which is awesome. I love when we are working with neighbors and partners and MnDOT and others to address transportation issues in our community. You will see that we have a lot of projects going on. We've got the can of worms. We've got lots happening over in the hospital area. And here in the city of Duluth, our voters approved a self-tax, a 0.5% sales tax to pay for road construction. That was ratified by the legislature, but I think passed in one of the previous elections, like I think it was in 2017, we passed it with 78% of the vote. that is a vote to self-tax to address transportation issues. So I share that because transportation is something people understand, and people are willing to pay for what they understand and what makes sense. So I want to just say a couple of other things. Along with that sales street tax, we hired a transportation planner. We are now actually doing things like aligning our streets projects with our utility projects, things like that that are actually really important and feel really good as a public servant to know that we are holistically addressing the foundational needs of people. The other thing that I've been thinking a lot about as it relates to transportation is that previous to being an elected person, I was a social worker, spent 12 years working with people who have little or no income, families who had housing instability, and the impact of transportation, what it means to get around is huge. It is huge. It's a status issue. It's an economic advancement issue. It's an opportunity issue. And so for me, transportation has been such a fun, deep dive. And there is no kind of staying on the surface of transportation. You have to get all the way in it. So as we are tracking different issues this year, and I know this alliance is tracking the infrastructure bill and tracking, capital bonding projects as they come forward, and all of the other really important funding opportunities that are coming our way. Here in the city of Duluth, we are here for it. We are ready to, advance this community in ways that help people get around safely, help people get around who have layers of abilities, and get around in ways that are dignified and allow them to have social connections. So thank you for all that you do. I know we have many local people in this audience, and thank you for the work that you do to support transportation and engineering and good, healthy living in this community. Your work is really important. And it's wonderful to actually be in a room with people live and in person to do this collective work together, because there is an energy that comes from just being in the same room and understanding that the collective work is even more important than the individual projects. So welcome to Duluth. I hope you have a safe and wonderful stay. Lots to do and check out. Hope you stay an extra day or two, and maybe your family will join you. But if this is your first time here, welcome. We hope you feel at home, and we hope you come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Larson, for the voice and support of transit. With that, I'd like to introduce the president of the Wisconsin Public Transit Association, Tom Wegener.
Thanks, Rep. So my name's Tom Wegener. I'm the current chair of the Wisconsin Public Transportation Association. This will probably be my last official activity. I'm also the transit manager in the city of Eau Claire in Wisconsin. And thank you for coming. Thank you for getting together. It's like, I just want to echo what everybody else said, that this is great to be able to see everybody again in person. Resilient and strong is what we came up with the theme. And that's what we are. And that's what we've shown and proved to be. And certainly it has to do with the people that we're representing here. It's those people that didn't have the chance or the option of working remotely. They had to work in their office, which is right there with the public. And I think that resilience and strong, that reflects what we are as an association, and our members that we represent, really the drivers and the people that use public transit. It's just amazing to me, after what we've gone through, and to see in the various backgrounds that our people come from, and how they responded to everything that was going on, the new procedures that we asked them to do, the new regulations that we were asked to implement. All these things just prove that theme even more. We are resilient and strong. So thank you for coming. And it's been a pleasure to be able to serve in the state of Wisconsin. I know that things are just going to get even stronger and better in the years to come. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Ryan Daniel, CEO of St. Cloud Metrobus and the president of the MIPTA. Welcome to the Minnesota and Wisconsin Fall Conference Expo. This is our three-day signature event featuring dynamic presentations from industry experts on today's pressing challenges and novel solutions being implemented by innovative transit leaders. I look forward to seeing and connecting with you over the next few days. Thank you and enjoy the conference. With that, I would like to kick off our next session titled Federal Funding Update. Joining us for this session, we have Scott Bogren, Paul Skoutelas, sorry, Paul, and Kelley Brookins. Kelley Brookins joined the Regional 5 Office of the Federal Transit Administration in January 2014. During her tenure, she has led a multidisciplinary staff who consistently achieve ambitious organizational goals in the development and delivery of the FTA's capital, operating, and planning programs to complex and multimodal transit systems in the Midwest states of Ohio, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois. She is responsible for directing significant regional program activities, managing and administering an annual $10 billion grant portfolio, and has successfully worked with grantees to achieve high visibility projects. Paul Skoutelas is the president and chief executive officer of the American Public Transportation Association, known as APTA. His entire career has been in public transportation, serving in both the public and private sectors. Prior to joining APTA in 2018, Skoutelas served as a senior vice president for WSP USA, one of the world's largest architectural and engineering firms, and the national director of WSP's USA's Transit and Rail Technical Excellence Center. He was also the chief executive officer at the Port Authority of Allegheny County, known as PAT, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the Central Florida Regional Transportation Authority, known as LYNX, in Orlando, Florida. Skoutelas served on numerous boards and committees, including the Transportation Research Board, the Mineta Transportation Institute, Eno Center for Transportation Learning Center, and the Alliance to Save the Energy's 50/50 Commission on the U.S. Transportation Sector Efficiency. He is a member of the U.S. Department of Energy's Executive Advisory Board on Smart Mobility and the Carnegie Mellon University's Mobility 21 Advisory Council. Scott Bogren has been with the Community Transportation Association of America, CTAA, since 1988, serving the association in a wide variety of roles before being named executive director in 2016. He is passionate transit advocate and has once again resumed being a daily transit user. His work has always been focused on building and promoting safe, affordable, accessible, and inclusive mobility for all Americans. A proud graduate of Indiana's University Journalism program, Scott lives in Germantown, Maryland with his wife, Beth. Thank you all for being here. I will turn it over to Kelley Brookins.
Thank you. I appreciate that introduction. Good morning, everyone. I wanted to begin by thanking the Minnesota Public Transit Association and the Wisconsin Public Transportation Association for inviting the FTA to provide updates during this conference. I'm gonna share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, perfect, perfect. So as stated previously by several of the prior speakers, we at the FTA, we applaud each of you for your commitment to transit. Certainly it's widely known that transit agencies have kept transit open during the most significant public health crisis we've ever seen in our country. I'm pleased to speak with you today during this pivotal time in the transit industry. The United States Department of Transportation's priorities are to improve safety, to promote equity, to combat climate change, and create jobs. And the resounding message in America is America's open and transit's open. So today's presentation, I'll provide you with FTA updates, as well as some grant activities and news that you should know. FTA's administrator, Nuria Fernandez, was confirmed by the United States Senate as the 15th administrator of the Federal Transit Administration. She's also the first Senate confirmed administrator in over a decade, and she was confirmed by the United States Senate on June 10th of 2021. Ms. Fernandez, she came to FTA after serving as a general manager and CEO of the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority. She was responsible for over 2,100 employees. She oversaw projects, programs, and transit services that provided mobility solutions for more than 2 million people who live and work in the Silicon Valley. And prior to leading VTA, she served in leadership positions at some of the busiest transit agencies in America, including Chief Operating Officer of the New York Metropolitan Transportation Association, Senior Vice President of Design and Construction at the Chicago Transit Authority, and the Washington Area Transit Authority consecutively, as well as serving as commissioner for the Chicago Department of Aviation, overseeing the airports for O'Hare and Midway as well. In addition, she served as chair of the American Public Transportation Association from 2019 to 2020. Here's a picture of our org chart. It may be a bit too small to read, but the regional team members who work with you in Minnesota and Wisconsin are Hassan and Colin and Matt, Evan, Elamar, Marilisa, and Bill. One change to our org chart is that I'm pleased to announce that Stuart McKenzie, who previously served in our financial management and program oversight office as a community planner, he's recently been promoted and he currently serves as the director in that office. So exciting things are happening. Let's talk about the funding, federal funding, and I'll begin with the supplemental funding. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, we like to call it the CARES Act. It provided emergency assistance and healthcare response for individuals and families and businesses affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. The CRISA, the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, it included $900 billion in supplemental apportionments and appropriations for COVID-19 relief, and $14 billion of that was allocated to support the transit industry during COVID-19 public health emergency. And then there's the ARP Act, the American Rescue Plan. It provided immediate relief for American families and workers, and it contains funding to help speed up vaccine distribution, reopen schools, help communities that were struggling in the wake of COVID-19. And of course, it provided support to the transit industry to keep operating and helping communities across the nation with the COVID-19 recovery efforts. You've heard it before, I'm gonna say it again. I can't thank you enough for all you've done on behalf of the American people to keep transit moving. This funding has been critical in supporting the vibrancy of transit. And as you continue to provide safe service to the frontline and essential workers, thank you. Thank you for all you do, all you've done, all you continue to do. Although the fiscal year 2022 budget is still being negotiated and discussed in Congress, the budgetary appropriations for 2022 are still pending. However, on September the 30th, the president signed a continuing resolution into law, and that extends the fiscal year 2021 government funding through December the 3rd. And in addition to that, though there was a pause, the president did sign a 30-day extension to the FAST Act which is the surface transportation authorization, and that's extended through October 31st. Let's talk about some recent grant activities and the funding that's been provided to Minnesota and Wisconsin. There's been significant activities last year as well as this year. Over $900 million this year alone to Minnesota, over $200 million to Wisconsin in both this year and last year. Lots of activities, lots of things happening. And again, we just recognize that it is the frontline team members, the transit professionals that have kept transit moving to support the essential workers. Some of our discretionary funding programs also, Minnesota and Wisconsin recipients were successful. The Bus and Bus Facilities Grant Program, it's identified to assist in the financing of bus and bus facilities, capital projects, replacing and rehabilitating, purchasing and leasing vehicles, as well as rehabbing facilities. The Metropolitan Council on behalf of Minnesota Valley Transit Authority was selected, as well as Minnesota Department of Transportation, the City of Madison, and Milwaukee County in Wisconsin. The Low and No Emission Competitive Program provides funding to state and local governmental authorities for the purchase and lease of zero emission and low emission transit buses. And Metro Transit was successful in submitting that discretionary grant, and they'll receive funding under that program. Also, there's the United States Department of Transportation's BUILD program, and it's funded under the Major Surface Transportation Infrastructure Project program, and it provides significant local as well as regional funding. And FTA provides grant support for selected BUILD projects that serve public transportation. The Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa was successful in their discretionary application, and they'll receive over $5.8 million for their project. Accelerating Innovative Mobility, the AIM grant discretionary project. Minnesota Department of Transportation was selected. This particular program is an initiative which highlights FTA's commitment to support and advance innovation in the transit industry. The AIM program is designed to drive innovation by promoting forward-thinking approaches to improve transit financing and planning, system design, and service. And just to provide some insight into some current funding opportunities, we have 5 that are currently active. There's the passenger ferry program offering $38 million. And the deadline for submission is October the 5th. So that's today, and there is still time. The passenger ferry program, it provides competitive funding for the projects that support passenger ferry systems in urbanized areas. It's core investment and enhancement and revitalization of public ferry systems. Another program is the Research to Practice Initiative, which offers $545,000 for the research program, identifying strategies to promote widespread adoption of innovative solutions that will improve public transportation. Another discretionary opportunity is the American Rescue Plan. So this is additional assistance above what was already provided, and what's being offered is $2.2 billion, and the deadline for submission is November the 8th. And this funding is available to discretionary process to eligible recipients or subrecipients of the urbanized area formula funds or the rural area formula funds. And again, this is in response to the coronavirus pandemic, and eligible expenses are everything that's associated with the 5307 program: operating costs, personnel, cleaning, sanitization, combating the spread of pathogens on transit systems, even debt service payments incurred to maintain operations and to avoid layoffs and furloughs. And we also have the Route Planning Restoration Program, providing $25 million. The submission deadline is November the 15th, and funds are provided under this program to support planning associated with restoring transit service that may have been reduced due to the COVID situation. And last but certainly not least, there's over $409 million available for the bus and bus facilities grant program. And the submission deadline is November the 19th. And this program makes federal resources available to direct recipients as well as to states to replace, rehab, purchase vehicles, as well as update facilities. Also wanted to point out that we currently have a request for information, which is soliciting input on potential transit worker safety mitigations, as well as potential minimum safety standards for roadway worker protection programs. And this input is critical because we want to make sure that the American transit workers are safer and provide for the safety of the frontline staff. Safety is paramount in the transit industry, and we're committed to ensuring that we can do everything that we can to ensure that approaches for workers who make our transit systems possible, safety can be maintained. So certainly encourage you to look at that request for information and provide feedback and comments. Also wanted to point out that throughout the summer of this year, FTA facilitated a national conversation to highlight how transit agencies have kept transit open during the most significant public health crisis we've ever seen in this country. FTA gathered ideas from 3 listening sessions that featured over 45 panelists. We focused on best practices to renew ridership and safety, with a focus on building community partnerships and how to build back better and highlight the most promising strategies to encourage riders to get on board. We also had a transit renewal summit, and this summit summarized the best practices and the strategies that the transit agencies share. Transit agencies, industry partners, and advocacy agencies also participated. Certainly, the summit culminated a series of events, and more than 300 transit professionals and stakeholders joined us in the national conversation. If you happen to miss the listening sessions or the summit, or just want to hear the best practices and the information shared, again, the information and the recordings from those engagements are available on our website. So I certainly encourage you to go to the website. And as always, at the bottom of every single page of the FTA website offers an opportunity to register to receive Gov Delivery alerts and information. And that information is provided as it relates to notices of funding opportunity, notices of proposed rulemaking, as well as other great information that we have to share. So I certainly encourage you to sign up. You don't have to select all of the options. You can choose which areas you want to receive updates on. I would be remiss if I didn't share just some highlights of some of the great work that's happening there in Minnesota as well as Wisconsin. So again, thank you all for all that you do in support of transit, our essential workers in our nation, particularly now by working together and focusing on our collective efforts and on these priorities. I know we can renew ridership. We like to continue to hear from you as part of FTA's national conversation about best practices to help transit agencies across America renew ridership. And here are just a few examples of transit efforts supporting people. So this is an example of Green Bay Metro, along with Brown County Public Health and local healthcare partners. They created opportunities for the Department of Human Services approved vaccinators to bring vaccines to the local community to help stop the spread of COVID-19. With the mobile vaccine bus, they installed driver barriers to protect the drivers and the riders. They installed air purification systems on the fixed route buses. And they were actually the first in North America to install this technology on their entire fleet. So that certainly is something to be applauded and serve as a best practice. Also, Mankato Transit System is part of the community efforts to fight the spread. They included testing and vaccination sites as one of their common destinations. They eliminated rider fares for the calendar year and helped eliminate barriers to transportation for the community. Another excellent example of great things that are happening Mankato also purchased equipment to improve health and safety for the passengers as well as the drivers. They installed protective shields and poly seats that improve the ability to sanitize the vehicles, and they installed hand sanitizing stations. Another example, lacrosse, they took several measures to combat the pandemic. They invested in the UV filtration system that cycles clean air, and it's 99% effective against viruses. They also installed germ barriers to help keep operators safe. And they also are implementing additional steps to install touchless pay systems to allow passengers to scan their phone and not have to handle cash or passes. And all of these activities are funded through the supplemental apportionment as well as the 5307 programs. And all of the supplemental apportionments are 100% federal share. Forest County Potawatomi community, at the height of the pandemic, they were forced to suspend their service, and during the furloughs, they lost several of their transit workers, but in response, they submitted a discretionary tribal grant application, and they were selected to receive the funds. They were able to hire additional drivers, service was restored, and now they're setting up a new mobility on demand software to assist with their dispatching. Another example is the city of Oshkosh, where they use the federal relief funds to install permanent driver protection barriers, also install air and surface purification systems on their vehicles. And they're installing new automatic wheelchair securement systems, which allow the users to secure their mobility devices without the need for driver assistance and contact. So another great example of things that are happening. Also, throughout Minnesota, providers assisted with delivering, over 300,000 meals to communities to assist in ensuring that health and safety for at-risk individuals. They provided food delivery, the Trailblazer Transit, serving over 115,000 meals. Smart Transit with over 56,000. Minnesota public transit providers contributed in various ways to assist with the needs in their community, free rides, food delivery, mobile vaccine units throughout partnerships with the Minnesota Department of Public Health and Metro Transit. The Minnesota community, they rose to the challenge and they made a dramatic difference in the lives of those Minnesotans. Lots and lots of really great examples. White Earth Public Transit, they are using resources, provide services to over 9,000 people to support COVID testing and vaccination clinics. And when the routes were temporarily reduced, they repurposed their vehicles to provide and secure necessary resources such as food and clothing. And just another example of really great things that are happening to really support the community as well as provide transit services. And this is the last example I'll provide, but there's so many more examples of great work that's happening in Minnesota and Wisconsin. The city of Madison auto service was reduced. They reassigned employees, they safeguarded their health. They deployed others to ensure that the vehicles were cleaned and sanitized. They provided for additional flexibility. They've adjusted the service, they added trips, and they met the needs of the riding public. And then as demands changed, they were resilient. They ramped up their service to support the return to college students to the campus. And as with most things, to keep the customers safe, Madison Metro, they purchased disinfecting, fogging machines, ionizing machines, masks for employees and the general public, bus shields, and so many more examples of Minnesota and Wisconsin transit agencies, workers, and doing their part to communicate the message that America's open and transit's open. Just to provide a couple of additional updates, we have a free web-based application called Procurement Pro, and it's a guide for rural and tribal grantees as well as state DOTs as it relates to FTA's procurement procedures. So I certainly encourage you to go to our website. The link is listed on the slides, and the slides will be made available. It provides help with resources, procurement document templates, checklists, and guidance for preparing procurement documents. Also, these are a few examples of resources available on FTA's website, but keep in mind, there's also the option to sign up to receive updates and be the first to know when information and funding becomes available. So certainly encourage you to do that. Also, the president signed an executive order to implement a multi-factor authentication process, and FTA's implementation of that process was the Transit Integrated APTA Development Logon, and that went into effect on September the 10th, and it establishes a single log on for accessing ECHO and trams and the other public facing systems. So certainly, if you have not already, please go to login.gov and create an account. As a reminder, the mass mandate has been set. It was set initially to expire September the 13th, and the Biden administration extended the mass mandate for travelers on airplanes, trains, and buses, as well as in train stations. And that's through January the 18th of 2022. Also wanted to point out that Region 5 will be providing a webinar on the federal financial report as well as the milestone progress reports. And the webinar will occur October the 14th at 9 o'clock Central. Certainly registration is required, and you can go to the Region 5 website to find additional information relating to the webinar, or reach out to your assigned program manager and they can provide you with the information as well. Also, save the date, November the 30th, FTA will host a real estate workshop. As you all probably know, September the 24th, TRAMS closed for its annual reconciliation process, and TRAMS will be closed for approximately 6 to 8 weeks. If you go to the TRAMS site, there is a fact sheet detailing the available functions during the closure, as well as some of the functions that are not currently available until TRAMS reopens. Along that vein, in terms of the reconciliation process, ECHO system is closed. It closed on September the 27th, and it will remain closed until October the 7th. So that'll be Thursday. So it will reopen on Thursday. So during the reconciliation process, no drawdown access will be available. Also, as always, the regional team works with you. In Minnesota, it's Matt Lane, Colin Corris, Bill Wheeler, and Hassan Dastagir. And in Wisconsin, it's Evan Gross, Colin Corris, Matt Lane, Marilisa Travella, Bill Wheeler, Hassan Dastagir, and Elamar Alvarado Miranda. This is Transit's moment. I know you all will join me in supporting the administration's goals to promote safety and equity while we do what we do best, which is provide transportation options that contribute to the nation's economic recovery. And in the long run, we help eliminate the climate crisis. Again, thank you for all you do to support transit, our essential workers, and our nation, particularly now, but certainly always. And by working together and focusing on our collective efforts, we can continue to achieve great things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelley. Do we have any questions from the audience for Kelley before we switch gears to Paul? Going once, going twice, no questions? Okay, thank you, Kelley. Next, we have Paul Skoutelas from APTA.
Thank you, Ryan, and good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you, and I congratulate you for pulling this together as an in-person meeting. It is my hope that perhaps the next time around I'll be able to join you in person as well. And let me just say that I congratulate the leadership of all of you in the audience, and certainly the leadership of your associations for what they do to advance the cause of transit. Ryan, to you, to Tom, to Rod, to Margaret, we do appreciate your leadership on the ground not only delivering transit, but advocating for transit. And at the end of the day, that's what really we're all about, is to advocate for our industry, for our communities, and for the people we serve. Kelley, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you for the thoroughness of what you covered there. And I must say, it is transit's moment, as you said, and in part it is because of the leadership at FTA. You and your team, Nuria Fernandez, and the FTA professionals who really embrace transit, who work with all of us, with all of you that are running systems to really do what's best for your communities. And we have a great partner in Nuria and the FTA team. As you may know, Nuria came over to her appointment as FTA administrator after serving as APTA chair. So we know her well, we respect her for her values, for her expertise, and we're in good hands in terms of our partnership with the FTA. So Kelley, thank you for all that you and your team do. Again, it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to start with where we are today relative to our transit initiatives. Kelley touched on them very briefly, and we are, from a good news standpoint, under a continuing resolution, meaning that appropriations continue through December the 3rd. So the federal government continues, the FTA continues to function, and that, of course, is good news. You'll remember back in 2019, we had a prolonged shutdown, which really did create havoc for the industry. So we have a continuing resolution. That's a really good news thing. The other was that we were very concerned with the FAST Act, with its expiration as of September 30th, that would lapse and throw the surface transportation programs, both highway and transit, into turmoil. Congress passed the 30-day, 1-month extension. The president signed it, so we're good until October 31. But there's a lot of business to get done between now and then. And very briefly, we have the bipartisan infrastructure plan, which has been worked on now for many, many months, and really much longer than that in terms of our industry's focus on a new infrastructure and surface transportation renewal. And also what's been called the Build Back Better Act, which is the reconciliation bill that many of you have heard about, this $3.5 trillion package that deals mostly with the human infrastructure side, although there's some very important elements there for transportation infrastructure and for transit as well. That's a lot of work to get accomplished here in the weeks ahead. And so you're going to see and you're going to hear a lot of dialogue, a lot of back and forth politically and otherwise about what's happening. I think, you know, if you're like me, to be a student of what's happening in DC, as my good friend and colleague Scott Bogren is, there's a lot of tension and a lot of drama that's playing out in Washington, D.C. Over in the House moderates are wanting to vote on the bipartisan infrastructure plan, which passed the Senate. And I'll speak to that in just a moment. And then the progressives in the House on the Democratic side want this larger reconciliation package. And they are really wanting to hold up the infrastructure plan, perhaps to hold it as hostage out there until they can get a vote on both plans. And so the tension between the House and the Senate, the progressives and the moderates, and the White House is really what's going to be playing out here over the next days and weeks. So we'll keep a close eye on that. You may also want to be doing that as well, because it will, in fact, shape the future for the next 5 years here for what ultimately we have to do in public transit. So very briefly, the bipartisan infrastructure plan is really a landmark in terms of new funding and investment in public transit. About $107 billion for public transit over 5 years, more than a 63% increase in funding, and about $102 billion for commuter rail, Amtrak, and rail initiatives. So it is a robust funding bill across the board, one that we fully support as an industry and as an association, and are working hard to get passage of. The Build Back Better Act, while I mentioned $3.5 trillion is the advertised price, but there's no doubt that there's going to have to be compromise in order to get something passed. Probably half of that amount does still include some $10 billion additionally that's transit related, transit access for affordable housing in particular. So a lot of work to be done there. But what's brought us to this point of where we are today and the proximity that we feel to really getting this across the goal line and making a major achievement for federal investment? First, let me begin with what clearly is our objective at APTA and broadly for the industry, and that is to support the industry in every way possible, bring the largest investment that we can for public transit, and be a strong advocate, a strong voice. That really began with the onset of the pandemic. And you have heard the stories, you've heard Kelley really recount for you the striking examples of the kind of work that's been going on in Minnesota and in Wisconsin, and quite frankly, all around the country, that's really brought transit to light. You know, we have always been an industry that serves the essential worker. We're always been an industry that's essential services. But the pandemic really highlighted just the urgency, the importance of what you all do and what we do as an industry. Time and time again, community after community, large and small, all across the country, stories much like what Kelley shared with you, transit going above and beyond to serve the needs of people, to serve the needs of the community. And we recognized right from the outset that this was such a disruption with the pandemic that the industry would need a lifeline. It would not be able to navigate this difficult time in the space of 6 months or even a year, that it would take multi-years to be able to get our industry back to where it was. And so we worked very hard with Congress and the administration, particularly with Congress, to seek and to secure additional emergency funding related to COVID. And we were successful with 3 different appropriations, 3 different tranches, if you will, bring nearly $70 billion to the industry. The CRISA Act, the CARES Act, and the American Recovery Plan Act, all which brought significant funding to support the operations of our transit industry, the operations of our transit providers, knowing that that was the biggest need to keep our agencies afloat, to keep them functioning, keep them operating services, even when other sources of revenue were questionable and in many cases were drying up. What's really important here is that we were able to make the case by conducting 2 independent economic analyses that we shared with Congress and that we shared with the administration. And they showed the dramatic dislocation and disruption for the industry, and the fact that it would take a number of years to get us back to where we were. And in large measure, had a great deal to do with us making the successful case for the now $70 billion that's come. You all have been putting that to good use. And I must say, about from the CARES Act funding, about 98% of those dollars have been obligated, which is really good news. It demonstrates putting the resources to use. For the CRISA Act, about half of those dollars have been obligated. And for the American Rescue Plan, about a quarter. That last one was just the most recent enactment. So it's not a surprise that obligations there are not as robust as the others. But it's really important because Congress wants to know, and the administration wants to know, fine, we've approved these dollars now for public transit. We do believe that they're necessary. Are the dollars being put to use? And I appeared before the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee just last week to testify with regards to COVID emergency 19 funding. And I was able to make the case that these dollars are being used appropriately, importantly, to serve the communities, citing some of the examples that are similar to what you've heard from Kelley, but making the case the transit needs to be able to come out of this pandemic in a position to be able to serve its citizens and its communities well. You know, it's interesting, we like to do a number of surveys at APTA, and let me just share with you what some of the statistics are from some survey work that we've recently done. We have found from a recent survey that about half of the agencies in the country that participated in this stated that COVID-19 emergency funding helped them to avoid a complete shutdown of service. I think that's very striking. Nearly half of the respondents said that they would have had to shut down service completely without the emergency funding. Nearly 80% said that COVID-19 funding helped them avoid layoffs or furloughs. So this is in part what I was able to share with the committee last week, that this additional resources at the federal level serve to stabilize our industry, to keep it functioning and afloat, to serve people while our economy and while our country gets back on its feet. And that's really the mode that we're in now. we project that it's going to take at least a couple more years through 2023 to be able to get the industry nearly back to where it was pre-pandemic, or at least to some semblance of that. You know, it's interesting to note that about 75% or 65%, excuse me, of our transit agencies today, about 2/3, are operating at 75% of their pre-pandemic service levels. So we know there's been a lot of service adjustment, service reviews. I think it was Rod that said in his opening remarks, a comprehensive analysis of service is being done for Duluth. And this is, again, something that we're seeing and have seen over the last couple of years all around the country. Agencies doing comprehensive operations analysis, reviewing their services, redefining route structures and service times, span of hours, fares, fare structures, everything that it takes to operate successful service. We've seen our agencies, your agencies, take another look and do some replanning to position itself for the future. And I think that's a very, very healthy thing. So we've come out of a very difficult period. Kelley, once again, highlighted some of this, but you know, we've lost through the COVID pandemic, 545 transit workers who really, especially in the beginning of this pandemic, really didn't know the full extent and the risks associated with going to work every day on the front lines, opening up their bus doors, taking in passengers, delivering them, all the personnel that have and continue to have day-to-day contact with our riders. They did yeoman's work. They, in fact, have been heroes in the way that they function. And I think they have put a best foot forward for our industry that we should not forget. It is something that I think speaks well for what we do as transit, what our people do, and the commitment, dedication that people saw on behalf of transit workers. So there's a big job ahead of us, but I think the fact that we had served the public so well through the pandemic really created some momentum for us as an industry. And as we worked with Congress and the administration to make our case for more increased, for robust investment, the stories of how we serve the public, I think, helped us immensely in terms of making this case. Our work is not done, though. We have a lot of work ahead of us in terms of making sure that at least what is now simmering in Congress, that this gets enacted. The bipartisan infrastructure plan, as I said, it passed the Senate, but now we need to get it past the House. And there's no doubt that the president will sign it if it does get past the House. And then, of course, to do what we can to pass this larger, albeit likely smaller, reconciliation package that also includes some very important provisions for public transit. So I leave you with just the thought, a couple of things. One, thanking you again for the continued dedication that you and your organizations have made through this pandemic. And quite frankly, those of us who've been in this business and been on the operating side, as I had for more than half of my career, some 30 years, I know what it means to deliver service every day. I know the commitment that our operating people do. It's incredible. There are no more dedicated employees than the ones every single day that get out, bad weather, good weather, no matter what the climate might be, what the weather impacts might be, to deliver service who are in need, people who need their mobility. And one of the things that we have going for us is to know that mobility is really all about freedom for people to move about, freedom to hold a job, freedom to take a new job if the opportunity presents itself. That's what we represent in our cities and our communities. And our transit workforce makes us look good because they follow through on that commitment. So I thank you for your leadership in helping make that happen. The second is the fact that we must continue to work together as a united industry. You know, I'm here on this panel with my good friend and colleague, Scott Bogren. Scott and I have many, many occasions to be together on the dais to talk about these things. Perhaps he could give my remarks, I could give his, but they're all basically pointed to the same goals: to strengthen our industry, bring more investment to the industry, strengthen our organizations and our providers, our operators who have to deliver service every day. That's our overarching goal. And that's what we work towards. And to see the state associations working together here in Minnesota and in Wisconsin, the alliance that you've established, that's wonderful. because the linkage of advocacy continues to link together federal, state, and local. It has to be that linkage that remains strong, that remains united, that remains committed to growing our industry, to keeping it vital, to keeping it serving the communities that count on us for the services that we deliver. So with that, I thank you. I thank you for this opportunity. Look forward to any questions that you may have, and it's an honor to be with you.
Thank you, Paul. Any questions for Paul before I turn it over to Scott? Okay, hearing none. Thank you, Paul. Scott Bogren.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here in Duluth. Beautiful city. Ron, so nice to see so many buses out and about downtown yesterday. It reminds you of why we're all here today. You know, everything is kind of getting back to, I don't think we're there yet, but this concept that we've been hearing about for the last year and a half, the new normal. I don't know what that is, but I'm sure eager to get there. And these are the kind of steps that we see being taken ideally to get us there. And Paul's right. He and I appear virtually and in person all the time together. We could deliver each other's remarks, but it's always an honor to follow him, follow Kelley with the important words from the FTA, and really probably the most important piece is to follow a mayor like Mayor Larson, who gets it, who rode and who supports and understands the bigger picture and the real value of public transportation beyond just counting how many people are on a vehicle, and understands the outcomes that come from that. It has been a kind of crazy period in DC over the last year and a half. I've been working in the city for 30 plus years, and I can assure you I've never seen anything like it. And I can also assure you it's really nice to get out of DC and be here in Duluth. There's politics, which I'll admit to you all here, I don't enjoy, because basically all it is kind of a massive game of chicken and fighting constantly. Now, policy, working on behalf of CTAA's members to educate members of Congress about the value you provide in your communities and about the funding and investment you need to continue to do those things. Absolutely, that's the fun stuff. In the last month, we've really seen where those things collide. And oftentimes there's no real narrative to it. So I agree. I can't really say much more than Paul had to say about where we are. October 31st is the deadline now. The infrastructure bill, which includes reauthorizing the FAST Act, is in the bill. Let's talk a little bit about what's in that reauthorization, just so you have a very clear understanding of why CTAA and APTA are so supportive of it. And really, many of you rely on federal funding through sections 5307, 5310, 5311. CTAA, we focus, our members operate buses. So the bus and bus facilities program, section 5339, all of those in the bill would grow by 30% in the first year, and then would grow by 2% and change every year after that through the life of the bill, getting us close to an average of about 40% increases in those critical funding areas that you need. As well, there's some slight policy changes. For those of you who are small cities, there's an increase in the STIC funding program, which is a performance-based program for small cities. There are some slight policy changes, although I'll talk a little bit about how really this bill precluded a lot of that. But a couple of things: you'll now be allowed under this piece of legislation to sell vehicles back after they've gone through their useful life at a greater amount than $5,000. We pointed out to members of Congress over the last few years how it was not a coincidence that many vehicles around the country constantly sold for $4,999. It was a shocker. And that was really because anything over that, then it had to be turned back. Under that, it could be farmed back into the agency. So we've got some increases in that. And for a lot of CTA's members in the program that Kelley referred to as the low and no emission bus program, we've argued for years that there's a reason that the word low is in the low and no emission bus program, and that for many smaller agencies, things like CNG and others are very much important steps towards getting to zero emission. And there's steps that ought to be funded. And the program was designed, yet it only funded battery electric buses, largely for 35 and 40-foot buses for a lot of our rural members and even a lot of our smaller city members that are operating smaller vehicles. There were no battery electric buses. They're starting to come on the marketplace now. But we think it's important that all forms of public transit are contributing to the environmental change we want to see. And therefore, to get all these systems in, this bill puts 25% of the low and no emission bus program and allows that to be spent on things like CNG, propane, other very low emission bus programs. So, I spent the last 3 years telling Congress that they should simply demand certain emissions reductions in communities and let you as transit leaders figure out which equipment best suits your means to hit those marks. And I kept urging for a technology agnostic application. Did not win that fight, but it was good to see this 25% allocation in. And to go back, to give you a sense of kind of how crazy the last year and a half, we're moving towards, I guess, 1 3/4 years has been, the federal allocation out of the trust fund for public transit has tended to be 13 billion or so in our normal appropriation cycle, $13 billion. Last year in operating assistance alone through CARES, CRISA, and then the ARP funding, $70 billion. And importantly, we argued right at the outset, most of CTA's members, we really need to see that money arrive at 100% federal, knowing the local share challenges that many of our agencies were going to face, and further, arriving with no end date. I've been working in DC a long time. I never thought I would see that. And then follow that up with bills first coming from the House of Representatives, then through the infrastructure bill, and that add significant amounts of capital to public transit and investment. And I think this is a key point that I want to make with you today. And I'll talk about this a little further in the session that I'll be hosting here at 11 o'clock. This is a lot of money. And there's a narrative in DC, particularly among some of the more conservative Republicans, that it's too much money. And that is why in the Banking Committee of the United States Senate, which is supposed to develop a transit title, they bogged down and they weren't able to do that. And the narrative is all about how much. And everyone in this room, need to work on changing that narrative to what you've done and are continuing to do with those funds. How many of you, and I'm not going to ask you to raise hands because I've been a speaker long enough to know trying to do that before 10 a.m. is death. But just think to yourselves, how many of you have made changes to your system from a safety perspective and redefined safety at your agencies in ways that are going to be permanent? Because they are. If you're waiting for a world where there is no COVID-19, you're going to be waiting a long time. That's the reality. We have to figure out how to safely live in a world alongside this virus. And I'm very confident we can do that. But that means your previous definition of safety at your agencies, whether you're a rural or an urban, a non-emergency medical transportation or a specialized operator, was driver training, maintenance, and making sure those vehicles are safe before they go out every day. And now what have you added to that? A lot. Let's also talk, when we're talking about value, let's talk about how many of you, we breezed past this notion of essential over the last year and change. But we've learned a lot that if we were here in 2019, 2 years ago, we wouldn't necessarily have thought were essential. For instance, how many of you pre-pandemic would have counted trips that take people to work at the grocery store as essential employees? But now we know they are. Healthcare, obvious. Taking care of older adults, allowing them to live independently. And frankly, when we saw in the initial parts of the pandemic, the awful ways in which this virus ran through a lot of assisted living centers, I know many of us, I thought to myself, CTAA's members that allow a lot of seniors to live independently, this is more important than ever before. How many of you take people regularly to vaccines? My point is, that is what we need the narrative to be about, and not just about, oh, how much money did they get? Because we can talk about that big number, $70 billion, and it's a mind-numbing number, as are the trillions of dollars that the federal government off budget has spent in the last year and a half to prop up the economy. But the value, that's something that's going to go on, that you need to get fluent in. When you look at it, if you take just the rural component out of that $70 billion, it was less than 5%. Small cities, population between 50 and 200,000, another 5%. CTAA's membership, which does not include the major metropolitan areas, largely about 10% of that total. So, I say that to make sure that you provide that kind of context for a reality-based discussion about these things, and not just get into trying to defend $70 billion one way or the other, and to try to bend that narrative to what you're doing and will continue to do, and how long you expect your communities to be suffering from the economic after effects of the pandemic. Some of us remember the last great economic depression in 2009 and 10. We remember the stimulus funds that arrived. And I remember at the time thinking how much money it was, and it's a drop in the bucket compared to what we've seen in the last year and a half. But one thing we learned very much was that rural America and smaller city America rebounded much more slowly then. And it took years, not months, to rebound. And frankly, it accelerated some fundamental changes in those communities that exist today and persist today. So, you know, there's a lot going on in DC. Let's talk about another reason why we really would like to see the bill pass, and for the Democrats to take the win that is sitting on the table, a group of folks who, again, I would not come before you and tell you I'm a great political pundit, but I do believe they need a win right now. And there's one sitting there. And let's hope that they come around and grab it. Think about, again, having worked in DC for 30 years plus. There's an equal and opposite reaction for everything that happens in Washington. And politicians will act like something that's happening now will happen forever. And usually forever is about a year. Things change. I fully expect the equal and opposite reaction to the last year and a half to be a much more conservative Congress arriving in Washington, D.C. In November of 2022. And I fully expect a period of budget austerity and cutting, because we spent trillions of dollars. Again, numbers I never thought I'd see. It will be very rough on us or any other industry that's attempting a 5-year authorization of its funding to be in the middle of that debate while in the middle of this coming budget crunch that I know is coming. So I've told our board, and we've focused absolutely on getting this reauthorization done and passed, because that will give us a 5-year step out of the limelight and let those fights happen without our fundamental funding levels being attacked. And I think that's really important. So the other pieces, I guess, that weren't mentioned earlier that I wanted to just keep you up to date on. As many of you know, the census in the middle of all of this was undertaken, and the census impacts many of you in this room in terms of your formula funding programs. And we do expect in November, right now, the UZA numbers to come out. And it's critical. Couple of reasons. You know, there's the 50,000 population mark that changes from rural to small urban. There's the 200,000 population that changes from small urban to large urban. Both of those are massive changes in the way a system runs. Just as importantly, though, are the ways in which the census tends to draw in communities into larger UZAs and combine communities into single urbanized areas. And that's a UZA. I'm sorry to be using the DC jargon. We've been following that closely. We had a lot of concerns. Many of our small urban operators operate in college towns, and I'm very concerned about the counts that were taken while much of the world's colleges were online. And what will the impact be? And something just to keep a sharp eye on. We'll certainly be publishing everything we can get our hands on as we get it. But it's another issue that is out there. What Paul raised and Kelley alluded to in the budget reconciliation piece, or the Build Back Better, the piece that is being debated and is being held hostage and is ending up holding the reauthorization hostage. That piece does include $10 billion additional into everything we've talked about for public transportation. And what they've tried to do is tied it to housing, low-income housing. And when the folks who were drafting that idea called me, I made sure they understood that small cities and rural areas have plenty of low-income communities that need service. They also are trying to define underserved communities. And we all know there are many of those in your service areas. And I was trying to remind them that some of these funds need to flow outside of just the biggest cities and into the rest of the state, who definitely are going to need these funds. This would all flow to the Federal Transit Administration as a competitive grant program. A $10 billion competitive grant program is a pretty big lift for them. Thankfully, there's some additional funds in there for the FTA to administer the program if it passes. A lot of questions about, and as we go through this month here in October and hopefully get to some resolution on these pieces, stay tuned to our website. We'll have all sorts of information on that for you. The other thing I wanted to recognize is one of the things that we tend to do in a reauthorization cycle is focus on right-sizing regulations in Federal Transit Administration law, because they tend to often to write regulations only for big cities and then try to scale those back for smaller areas. And they end up with not right-sized regulations. Unfortunately, in the run-up to creating that Senate agreement, there was agreement that the administration and this group of bipartisan senators agreed to not incorporate very many policy changes in what's sitting in that infrastructure bill. So largely, if it was in the FAST Act, it's in this piece of legislation, unfortunately, because we miss a chance to right-size some of these pieces. And I'm talking about oversight. We've been pushing, for instance, for the exemption from the federal safety rule that rural and 5310 operators have now to move up into the small urban space. That's one that we weren't able to move into it. We've also talked about oversight in terms of triennials and state management reviews. If your agency has had a good review for a period of time, maybe just having a desk review going forward and not having to go through what that entails every 3 years, regardless of how successful you've been. We've been asking for kind of a performance-based approach to those things so that they can really understand that at smaller agencies, there are few folks who wear many hats, and every penny that we have to spend chasing a regulatory burden that really doesn't make sense in a smaller city or in a rural area is a penny that we can't spend on doing what we want to do, which is providing trips. So I'm happy to entertain any questions. It has been a tumultuous period in DC. We see a victory right in front of us here. We hope that the Congress will take advantage of that. But your guess literally is as good as mine in terms of what they will choose to do. That's it. It's now not in a reality-based discussion. We are in now a political discussion. And that's one thing I have learned, particularly over the last 5 years. I would be a very poor guesser of what Congress will and won't do based on politics. I just don't know. But you must have some questions. It's hard to ask those maybe of folks on a screen, but I'm right here in front of you. So who will be the first? It's always the hardest one, break through. Yes, and thank you.
So any insight into their install?
It's a good question. I think they might through the end of the calendar year push a little bit, but you're to the point now where we are in the cycle of the 2022 election, and the Republicans are, I think, not going to, they want the Democrats to, with this infighting, implode. It makes for a very effective campaign message in the coming months. So it's really all on the Democrats. If they can get their act together and negotiate down the reconciliation piece, I think they could manage this. But earlier this morning, you know, it's really clear. Margaret and I were talking. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who has been actively in support of the infrastructure bill, does not like the tax implications in the reconciliation bill and are threatening to pull their support for the infrastructure bill. So there's just so much, but if they can't get it done, there's a certain period of time where the clock will run out. I don't think it's October 31st, particularly if they're close, but it's going to be a very difficult vote. And I'm not sure they will get it done. I think they will, but I also thought they would get it done on September 27th. So that shows you if you had put any money on something I was thinking. But the fallback would be probably to line up with the federal funding through middle of December. Yeah. They tend to do these in like month chunks, but that creates all sorts of hazards and havoc too with state DOTs and others. 112 funding and these kinds of things are not easily maneuvered. Margaret.
So in Minnesota, we've been working a lot on volunteer driver. And I'm just wondering if you're hearing from other states challenges with volunteer drivers and
So the question is on volunteer drivers and in particular, mileage reimbursements, which make all the difference in terms of being able to recruit volunteers. Look, right now, I'm sure everyone in this room is having a struggle just keeping enough drivers to make pullout. And so many of our systems are calling every day telling me, oh, I cut my weekend service, I'm cutting back evening service. I simply don't have the drivers. The volunteer driver piece is an important asset for a lot of agencies. And we have worked with Minnesota, and there are other states that are equally interested in making the federal reimbursement rate per mile at a certain level that would make it a lot easier to recruit volunteers. And I think another interesting piece, and Margaret, thank you for that question. You know, one of the things that we saw in the House's reauthorization bills leading into what we have now, there was a really terrible limousine crash in New York State in 2018. 20 fatalities. It was awful. And the New York congressional delegation's response to that was, we need to move the threshold where a vehicle must have a CDL driver down to 8 passengers. And, we didn't like that very much because it was already hard getting drivers, CDL drivers in particular. We reminded them that I actually offered up my staff to rewrite the legislation so it would only pertain to limousines. I said, we'll be happy to do that for you, but you've caught up everybody in the net. From every hotel that has a shuttle bus would now suddenly, that driver would have to have a CDL. I mean, it would have, for just in the transit field, it would have added 40 to 50,000 additional drivers needing CDLs that didn't previously. Yeah, we were able to kill that, and it kept coming back and we kept killing it off. And I never had the heart to go to the New York delegation and tell them that, in fact, unfortunately, the driver involved in that accident had a CDL. But we were able to get that focused just on limousines, thankfully. And we'll talk about it in my next session. I mean, look, the driver crisis is very real right now. I had a meeting with the National Association of Workforce Boards. They're going to offer help. We know that there's some changes into the CDL training piece that are going to come into effect in January that are going to make it harder still. Many of our members are having their drivers recruited away by Amazon, UPS, and FedEx. And they're offering a lot of money and sign-on bonuses and all manner of things. Thursday, we have a member webinar that we're going to listen and hear from some ideas on how to recruit and source drivers, but also really, I'll be leading that session with our membership. And I really want to come up with a cohesive solution or messages or parts of solutions that we can bring to Congress and the FTA right now. Because it's one thing to go to them and say, hey, we've got this massive driver shortage. And they may say, oh, wow, that sounds really bad. But we got to bring a solution that works for us. We've got to bring ideas, things that they can act on. And that's going to be the focus of this webinar on Thursday. So if you're a CTA member, you've probably gotten a link. It's on our homepage. It was in our email newsletter today. But the driver issue in general is a critical one. And the volunteer one, the problem you have is when you're trying to change reimbursement rates, you start dealing with different committees in Congress than transit committees. And then you're dealing with staff that maybe we don't have an existing relationship with, and they're kind of like, well, where is this coming from? We haven't heard. So it just requires, not that it can't be done, because it makes sense. And usually after we explain the issue, we get, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We should equalize these reimbursement rates, because it's always better where we can get volunteer drivers. And look, frankly, the volunteer driver base are largely recently retired individuals who kind of want to give back to their communities. And we want to make that as cost effective and easy to happen as possible. So those are commerce and taxing committees that we've reached out to. And I think we can make some headway on it. Anyone else? Well, I'll echo Kelley and Paul in saying thank you. I can't imagine the upheaval that all of you have felt over the last year and a half in trying to serve your communities and to do it as safely as possible. How much that many of you have time you spent worrying about, could someone get sick? Are my drivers safe? How are my passengers? The very beginning of the pandemic, I remember, in March of 2020, someone sent me this list of like, well, the pandemic will really be dangerous to people with these kinds of pre-existing conditions. And there was a whole laundry list of things. And I read through that and I looked at CTA staff and I was like, that's our passengers, and right then I just knew this is I remember when we were negotiating around the CARES Act, and Congress was saying, well, what will your systems need to get through to the end of September? This was in March. This couldn't possibly last beyond September. Well, you know, here we are. It's lasted way beyond September. So, you know, thanks for your diligence, for the work you've done. You know, public transit in all of its forms is a pretty thankless job. You can provide 1,000 trips today on time, safely, and all you're going to hear about is the one out of those 1,000 that wasn't. And that's what you'll be focused on. You know, people will let you know when it wasn't good, but no one ever says thanks in this business. But thanks. It has been a very trying period. We hope we can continue to get you the resources you need, and continue, please, to turn that dialogue into what you're doing and talk about your value alongside the discussions of how much, because we miss out on so much of our real story when we only focus on the how much. So thanks. It's great to be here today. And hopefully I can, if you have any questions,